Time to make a vest for my Loki cosplay. It's also the third vest I've made, this time for myself. I used a similar pattern, this one being without a collar. Somehow the measurements of this men's pattern hardly needed any adjustments. It is a Japanese brand, so that might be why. As this cotton fabric wouldn't shift much, I endeavored to fit all the pieces on the folded section. I had to keep the pieces as straight as I could to stay along the proper grain line. Surprisingly, it actually all fit. I also just didn't want to cut each piece out 4 times when I could just do 2. It was still a meticulous task, especially since the lining was just a copy of the outer. Although this vest is for a cosplay, I still want to make sure it's a good piece to wear outside of that. As I lined up the side piece to the front notch, I had the seam lined up with a notch as the pattern seemed to suggest. When sewing a straight piece onto a curve, I keep the curved one on the bottom. After sewing it, the armhole seam wasn't even, so I seam ripped it and redid it. This time I lined up the armhole side with the notch. I repeated on the other side, sewing on the left to ensure the seam is mirrored. This may just be me, but for some reason when I place my pins, the colored heads have to be varied, even when I'm the only one who would see it. After sewing the back, I moved to add the back sides. At this point, I really started to ponder this pattern. I don't think there should have been full seam allowance on both of the tips, as the seam flows directly into the armhole. When inspecting the pattern more afterwards, I suppose marking the tips right at the seam allowance would have helped. To test which alignment worked better, I sewed the bottom half and hand basted the curve in both versions. In the end, the second version fit me better. I wanted to make sure doing that wasn't going to create any unnecessary curvature below the shoulders. After that, I sewed the side seams and shoulders. I sewed along the armhole to keep it from stretching and create a guideline. I also ironed the seam allowance over, as well as pressing the seams. Now to repeat it all for the lining. To prepare the vest to be turned right side out, I sewed another guideline along the neck and pressed. I pinned along the edges from the collar and proceeded to sew. I started just below the shoulder seam curve to minimize distressing the fabric. When I stopped at this bottom point, I luckily only ran out of bobbin right then. I then sewed along the opposite edge. If you're not slightly ambidextrous, sewing along the left side might be a little challenging. Sewing carefully did take a while. For the little split at the bottom, I sewed each side separately, pushing all the seam allowance to the side. This provided a neat little splay right in the back of the vest. With the edges sewn, it was time to turn right side out through the gap at the neck. So far, so good. Time to add in my label. Personally, I don't like the feeling of tags, but I can't pass up on this personal touch. After basting the collar together, I top stitched all along the edges. Before this, I made sure to give the edges a good press with the iron. This helps make it nice and crisp. I do recommend clipping the corners a bit before turning right sides out. Next step is the armholes, which also hand basted first. This extra step makes sewing it much easier. We're actually almost done. The 4 buttonholes are next, which was quite nerve-wracking. Also ran out of bobbin again right at the end of the first one, thankfully. I only get one chance at those. Now to gingerly use a seam ripper to cut the slits in the buttonholes. They still turned out just fine. For the buttons, my best option was a weathered gold look. I couldn't find any nice green ones like the reference had, but these probably look better. Since the slits are horizontal, lining up the buttons was a little bit more difficult. I went around the four sides when sewing them on. I'm not sure why I did that instead of going up and across. It still looked aesthetic in the end. This came together quite quickly in a little over a week. I'm sure the wig will take just as long. This is actually my first ever cosplay. Also, face reveal, but I kinda needed to for this one. The wig video will be out next, so stay tuned.